Did you hear the story about the man who heard that most car accidents happen within 5 miles of his house? So he moved. It's actually true, though. According to a 2021 study by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in the United States, you are twice as likely to get in a car accident driving on roads that you consider familiar than roads that you consider unfamiliar. And there's two reasons for this. One, those are the roads you drive on most of the time, so it's just a law of big numbers kind of thing. But number two is that when we're in territory that we consider familiar, our brain goes into a kind of autopilot. Our brain is designed to process as little information at any time as it can because it's tiring to do new information. And that might be fine when it comes to brushing your teeth or doing the sort of kind of normal routines that we think about on a day-to-day basis, but it might not be ideal when we're piloting a 3,000-pound metal machine. And yet we kind of take the brains that we get rather than the brains that we want. Because, think about it. And I asked the question a moment ago, how many routines do you think you've engaged in so far today? Chances are, unless something dramatic happened, you woke up in the same place that you wake up at the same time that you wake up, you did what your normal morning habits are, then you came here, probably by the same way that you always come here. You came in, you sat probably in the same place that you always sit. And you've done what we always do when we gather in church. And even within each of those routines, there's a nesting doll of subroutines, of smaller routines. You brush your teeth in the same way. You lock your car in the same way. You position yourself when you get into the car in just the right way so that it feels comfortable and the same. We run on routines. This is what we were made for and what we were made to do. And this is part of how God has designed us. We live in a world of routine and we tell a story with our routines. None of these are things that are inherently really anything other than just us. But when routines tell a story that's less than helpful, sometimes those routines need to get shaken up. See, Nehemiah had grown up in Babylon. He had been a slave his entire life. He'd been a servant to the king his entire life. And his only connection to the stories of his past and of his homeland were stories that were passed down through the prophetic word, through the prophecies of Ezekiel and Jeremiah, who Nehemiah's parents had heard first preach. And so Nehemiah had to become kind of a student of history. His experience with his Jewish faith and his practice and his connection to the homeland was entirely something he had to learn on his own. And so Nehemiah had to become a student of history, a student of the writings. He looked and he saw the books that he had, the scrolls that were a part of understanding what it meant to be a Jewish man at the time. And as he read through these stories, he saw this recurring theme, that it begins with an exodus, where God intervenes on the side of the marginalized and the oppressed and the slaves to remind them that they're special in God's eyes, that God has a different standard of what's important than Egypt does. Egypt says the power of the Pharaoh is all consuming and all that matters. And God steps into that and says, no, you're wrong. God defines himself as being on the side of the oppressed and the marginalized and walks them literally through oceans on dry ground to bring them to a land flowing with milk and honey, a land where they could be, as Isaiah put it before the exile, a light to the nations. But being a light doesn't come without consequence. It doesn't come without a cost. It doesn't come without a weight that you have to wear. Because God doesn't change. God remains on the side of the marginalized and the oppressed. And part of the reason that Israel was created to be a light to the nations was that there were other Egypts all over the place. There were other systems of power and authority that said that all that matters is might makes right. And Egypt needed to be different, or Israel needed to be different. And so God's purpose for Israel was that Israel would be a source of justice and hope and equality in a way that no other nation in the world was. Israel would have a burden for the widows and the orphans and the aliens. Over and over again, through Deuteronomy, through the early prophets, through Isaiah and Micah, this phrase of widows and orphans and aliens, widows and orphans and aliens, widows and orphans and aliens becomes an almost mantra for the prophetic ideal. Because in a world where everything is determined by what land you have and what you can do with the land that you have, you need to understand that this defines your identity. But for people who have no land, they therefore have no identity. And so for the widows and the orphans and the aliens, they were nothing. They were less than nothing. They had no voice. They had no one to advocate for them. They had no purpose. They had no blessing. They had no hope in this world. And so God again and again reminds them that just like you were slaves in Egypt and I chose to be on your side, now you who have power and authority have an obligation to recognize that there are those among you who have none. And you are to be a light to the nations. You are to offer those who have no hope, hope. You are to offer those who have no joy, joy. You are to offer those who have no peace, peace. You are to be different because I was different to you. This is the story that Nehemiah grew up reading. And as anybody who rises through the ranks has to know, the patterns of behavior are a wonderful indicator of future progress. And so Nehemiah clicks because, as Ezekiel points out, if Israel had done a better job with the widows and the orphans and the aliens, they never would have ended up in exile in the first place. If Israel had done a better job of being what it was supposed to be, of being on the side of God who is on the side of the oppressed, on the side of the marginalized, on the side of the widows, the orphans, the aliens, the exile never would have happened. And here he is, now watching the walls get to their ideal height. And he sees Israel take a collective breath. He sees Israel relax their tense muscles for just a little bit. He sees Israel start to ask questions that they haven't had to ask in a long time. Because for the first time, they're not worried about their immediate security. For the first time, they're not worried about, am I going to make it through today? And so for the first time, they can start planning for the long term. And immediately that long-term planning turns to, well, what am I going to get out of this? Because I've had to mortgage my field to pay debts. Because I had to sell my children into indentured servitude. Because I owe more than I make. And so how do I fix this? Now that I have a little bit of power in my life, how do I leverage that power to make my life better? And Isaiah hears these things and doesn't necessarily disagree with them. In fact, recognizes that the emancipation of those sold into indentured servitude is important. Who recognizes that the paying down of debts is important, but not at the sacrifice of purpose. It's amazing that for 70 years, people could be in exile from a place, and as soon as they come back, old routines start to take place, start to take shape, start to define the new normal. For us here in the church looking at this story, the question might be different, but the circumstances might be different, but the question is the same. How do we, as a people of God living in this place, remind ourselves what our purpose is? Because the reality is that if we don't run our routines are going to run us. And so the challenge of routine is a challenge that we have to think clearly about, because for 2 years, the church was taken down to its studs. Everything that we did was put on hold and was canceled. And we have an opportunity in this moment with the entire church in Canada, in every corner of the country, to ask ourselves, what routine are we going to rebuild? Because we're going to rebuild some kind of routine. We're going to rebuild something. The question is going to be, is it going to be the right thing? And that's very much a live question for us. The challenge of being the church today is that routines are everywhere in our life. The way we even sit in church is something we do on routine. How we come into this place, how we greet ourselves, how we organize this gathering time together, we all do it on routine. And in that is a question of are we going to build to the same kind of decline that we had before the pandemic, or are we going to take this as an opportunity to build a new way of being Chippawa Presbyterian Church, of being the church in Niagara Falls, of being church in this Niagara region? And the reality of routine is that it's part of a larger cycle. It's part of a larger habit cycle. We have habits that are good and habits that are bad, and the challenge for the church of the future, the church that is seeking to embrace a missional mindset, is that we need to ask the question of what kind of routines help us build mission-forward thinking. The practical theologian Michael Frost has given us some tips and has done some of this work for us. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. In fact, he's identified 5 key points, all of which Nehemiah does at various points in his life, in his ministry with the people of Israel. By inviting the nation of Israel to cancel all their debts, to celebrate for the first time in Jewish history, at this point, the year of Jubilee that's spoken about in Deuteronomy, Nehemiah is challenging the people to actually and actively bless not just themselves, but the entire world. Because that was their purpose. That was what they were made to do. Can they be a blessing to people inside the church and outside the church at the same time? Secondly, can the people celebrate together? Can the people gather together to eat and drink and be merry? Because that is something that is a missional habit. When the people of God gather, they recognize that there is good news happening in their lives, and it is something worth celebrating. That the church is not a place to be filled with drudgery and monotony and suffering, but a place to be filled with joy and exuberation. Exuberation? I think that's a word. Sure, exuberance. There we go, thank you. Liz has got me back. Exuberance. That it's a place to be filled with celebration and good news, because God is at work in us and through us and among us. And so in a few weeks, you're going to be starting to hear announcements about our first big block party. In celebration of the mortgage being free and clear here at the church, we are going to open the doors to our neighborhood and invite every single person in the community of Chippawa to come and eat and drink and be merry. Because this is good news for our city. This is good news for our world, that our debt has been canceled, and so we are going to live life into a sense of celebration. For Nehemiah, this meant the people recognizing that they hadn't celebrated the Feast of Booths in over 100 years. This great feast of liberation had not been celebrated, and it was coming due. And so as harvest is preparing to happen, the people of Israel call for a celebration. Nehemiah sees the work wrap up and brings the people together, and they celebrate for day after day after day. And they celebrate for 3 straight days. Without resting, without ceasing, the people of God celebrate and eat well. The people with a missional habit also learn what it is that God is doing around them. People learn to see themselves as part of God's unfolding story in their community. They see themselves also as sent by God wherever life is going to take them from that place. And they find it as their responsibility to learn from the past, to see themselves as part of this movement of God into our neighborhood, into our city, and into our world. Our challenge, the thing that we're being called to and asked to do by this story, is to rethink our habits, both as individuals and as a corporate group, as a church. We need to rethink our habits, build new routines that bless our world, because that's what God has put us here to do. Because that's what God is already doing in our city. Because that's the heart of Jesus for our community. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and the Holy Spirit. For as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.